By 1968, the Vietnam War had become a maze of mud, rain, and smoke. It was a conflict without clear lines, without clear enemies. For American soldiers, the jungle itself was the battlefield, and the enemy, invisible. Imagine being 19 years old, freshly drafted, dropped into a country 8,000 miles from home. You have no idea what the language sounds like, no understanding of the customs, no knowledge of who is friend or foe. The Viet Cong used the land itself as a weapon. Rice paddies, rivers, thick jungle, hidden traps that could kill in an instant. Mines made from tin cans and nails, camouflaged like ordinary debris, could explode at the wrong step. Booby traps, tripwires, and ambushes were everywhere. Every patrol could end with a friend torn apart without warning. Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, had been in Vietnam only a few months. Yet the soldiers had already witnessed the cruelest sides of war. Friends blown up, comrades impaled by hidden spikes, explosions that left screaming men writhing in pain. And the Army's response was simple: kill the enemy before they kill you. The metric of success was body count. Victory was measured in numbers, not territory, not peace, not safety. The orders were repeated over and over: search and destroy. Find villages rumored to harbor Viet Cong. Eliminate all threats. But what if the threats didn't exist? That is a question that would haunt Charlie Company and the world in a way that history would never forgive. Intelligence reports identified My Lai, a cluster of hamlets, as a Viet Cong stronghold. But the reports were thin. In reality, no Viet Cong battalion was stationed there. No military headquarters, just villagers, farmers, children, the elderly, living quiet lives, unaware that their homes had become a target. Yet, in the minds of the soldiers, the lines were clear. Anyone in My Lai could be the enemy. The fog of war, combined with fear and exhaustion, was a dangerous mix. They had lost friends, and the rage was ready to spill over. Captain Ernest Medina, the company commander, briefed his men the night before the operation. He was ambitious, eager to show results to higher command. He told his soldiers that the Viet Cong would resist, that they were in enemy territory, and that casualties among civilians were to be expected. For soldiers already on edge, the distinction between combatant and civilian blurred. Orders to shoot anything that moves would later be repeated in testimony, word for word, etched in history. On the morning of March 16th, the soldiers of Charlie Company assembled. Young men barely out of high school, trained to fight, now carrying the burden of fear, anger, and exhaustion. Some were on their 2nd or 3rd tour. Sleep deprivation and combat stress had warped judgment, and the jungle amplified every sound, every movement a possible threat. Private First Class Paul Meadlow, later to testify, would say, "I couldn't even think straight. We were following orders. That was all I knew." The psychological tension among the troops was palpable. They were conditioned to obey. Fear of failure, fear of appearing weak, and the sheer chaos of guerrilla warfare created a perfect storm. The stage for My Lai was set, and the script for horror had already been written. Charlie Company. The psychological unraveling. The soldiers of Charlie Company were not killers by nature. They were young men from towns and cities across America. But the war had hardened them in ways that are almost impossible to convey. Imagine walking through a village you've been told is hostile. The intelligence says there are Viet Cong fighters. Your friends have died to hidden traps. Every face could hide a knife or a gun. Every movement a threat. The cumulative stress, fear, grief, exhaustion, anger becomes a psychological weapon. The mind begins to rationalize what it otherwise would not. Civilians become suspects. Innocent gestures, laughter, or panic are interpreted as hostility. Lieutenant William Calley, the platoon leader, was 24, a man tasked with leading young men into combat under conditions he barely understood, with no real enemy to fight. He gave orders that would later become synonymous with atrocity. Treat anyone who runs as the enemy. Treat anyone who stays as a threat. Soldiers like Maidelo and others later described the day as surreal, like waking into a nightmare that refused to end. Some tried to resist, some hesitated, and some obeyed without question. Obedience to authority, a fundamental principle of military training, clashed with the instinct for humanity. This was more than war. This was a breakdown of moral order, an unraveling of the human psyche under pressure and fear. The night before the massacre, soldiers slept fitfully. Some wept quietly, others prayed. Some tried to block out the horror they expected to witness. Yet when dawn broke, none were prepared for what was to come. March 16th, 1968, the morning the world collapsed. The morning began like any other in My Lai. Women swept the dirt floors of their huts, preparing rice and vegetables for breakfast. Children ran barefoot between the huts, their laughter echoing lightly over the fields. Old men, hunched with age and work, tended small gardens and watched the sun rise over the endless paddies. Then the helicopters appeared. Charlie Company descended with precision, trained and focused. Soldiers hit the ground, weapons ready, adrenaline pumping. But unlike other operations, there was no resistance, no Viet Cong, no ambush, only villagers. The tension among the soldiers was electric. They had been told this was a hostile village. The fear of unseen enemies, combined with exhaustion and rage over prior losses, created a lethal combination. Every shadow became a target, every movement a threat. Lieutenant William Calley, already stressed and impatient, made his decision. A single command would change the course of the morning forever. Round them up, kill them, and the firing began. A young girl carrying water to her mother's hut was the first to fall. An elderly man praying at the edge of a rice paddy was next. Then children, running in terror, were shot from the sides, their small bodies collapsing into the mud. One by one, villagers were herded toward the central drainage ditch. Mothers held infants over their heads, praying, pleading. Calley walked alongside, issuing commands and ensuring compliance. You know what to do. The soldiers obeyed. Some refused, some froze in shock. Others followed the command without hesitation, their fingers tight on the triggers. The ditch, later known as the My Lai Ditch, would become a mass grave for over 100 civilians. Mothers, children, and elderly were shot at point-blank range. Some were bayoneted, some were forced to climb over the bodies of their neighbors before being executed themselves. Private Paul Meadlow described it later. I couldn't stop. I didn't even know who I was shooting at. It was like I was part of a machine. The massacre was methodical in its chaos. Soldiers moved through the village, shooting into homes, burning huts with families still inside, shooting livestock, destroying rice stores, leaving nothing behind. Even the village dogs were not spared. One of the most horrifying aspects was the breakdown of time. Soldiers later recalled how minutes seemed like hours. They moved from one hut to another, following orders, yet internally a part of them recoiled at the sight of children being killed. The mind struggled to reconcile training with instinct. Some soldiers wrote in letters home later that day, "I don't know if I'll ever sleep again. I can't stop seeing them lying in the mud, the kids, the women." The village had become a theater of death. By the end of the morning, over 500 civilians lay dead. There had been no armed confrontation, no Viet Cong. Only obedience, fear, and rage unleashed in its most destructive form. Yet, not every soldier complied. Some refused, hiding victims or signaling their superiors for help. These rare acts of conscience would later become a crucial part of the testimony during investigations. The horror of the morning was compounded by the psychological torment that soldiers would carry for the rest of their lives. Some drank heavily to dull the memories, others suffered breakdowns or nightmares. The lines between perpetrator and victim blurred. Morality became a casualty alongside life itself. Shoot them all. The psychology of obedience and atrocity. To understand My Lai, we must understand the psychology that made it possible. Obedience to authority is a central tenet of military training. Soldiers are taught to follow orders without question, to suppress hesitation, to act decisively in combat. This obedience can save lives on the battlefield, but in My Lai, it became deadly. Lieutenant Calley's command to shoot them all wasn't just an order. It was a trigger that unleashed months of fear, fatigue, and anger into action. Soldiers' moral compasses were suspended. Civilians became enemies in the mind of every man who had been trained to survive, obey, and destroy. Some soldiers later described a dissociative experience, watching women and children fall, yet feeling detached, as if watching someone else's nightmare. The body acted, the brain struggled to catch up. This is the dark intersection of training and terror, where morality is overwritten by survival instinct and authority. Even within the platoon, there were fissures. Private First Class Dennis Conti, another soldier present that day, recalled, "I couldn't do it at first. I hesitated, and I saw men around me just shooting. I felt pressure, fear, and shame all at once. I wanted to stop, but I couldn't. This is not an excuse, but a window into the human psyche under extreme duress." The soldiers' actions, while individually horrifying, were compounded by systemic failure. The military hierarchy ignored warning signs. Commanders encouraged body counts. Intelligence reports were thin, but aggressive tactics were mandated. Fear and exhaustion became a breeding ground for atrocity. Every house searched, every person confronted, every movement interpreted as hostile. The villagers of My Lai had nowhere to hide. By midday, the massacre had reached its peak. Huts burned, corpses piled in ditches and fields, rice stores destroyed. The village, once alive with children's laughter, was a graveyard of innocence. A helicopter that refused to look away, Hugh Thompson's stand. Above My Lai, the massacre continued, invisible to the higher command, yet terrifyingly visible to one man. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, Jr. Thompson piloted a UH-1 Huey helicopter over the village, observing a scene that made his stomach twist. Bodies lay sprawled in the mud. Women held infants over their heads, pleading. Children ran only to fall, shot mid-step. Soldiers were firing indiscriminately, moving from hut to hut. Thompson realized this was not combat. This was murder. He radioed his command, Something is wrong down here. These are civilians. You need to intervene. The reply? Nothing. Silence. And so Thompson made a decision that would define him. He landed his helicopter between the soldiers and a group of survivors, fully aware of the risk. If they fire on these civilians, you will open fire on American troops, he ordered his co-pilot and crew. The threat was real. He was prepared to shoot his fellow soldiers to protect the innocent. Thompson evacuated as many civilians as possible. Some were wounded, some were terrified. But every life he saved became a testament to conscience in a sea of chaos. He filed a report detailing what he had seen. He expected accountability. He expected justice. What he received was indifference. His report was buried. The massacre remained officially a successful operation for months. Yet, without his actions, countless more civilians would have died. Thompson's courage stands as a stark contrast to the compliance that characterized the rest of the operation, the silence, the whistleblower, and the journalist. For almost a year, the Army's official reports presented My Lai as a victory. 128 Viet Cong killed, 0 American casualties. No mention of 500 innocent civilians. No mention of women, children, or elderly. But not everyone remained silent. A soldier named Ron Rittenhauer, stationed elsewhere in Vietnam, heard fragmented accounts of what had happened in My Lai. Horrified, he wrote letters to members of Congress, to military investigators, and to senior officers. This was not combat, this was mass murder. His persistence forced a federal investigation. Meanwhile, the story caught the attention of a journalist, Seymour Hersh, who would later bring the massacre to the public eye. Hersh interviewed soldiers, cross-referenced testimonies, and compiled photographic evidence taken by Army photographer Ronald Haberle. The photos were shocking. A toddler dead on a road, a woman lying across her children. The infamous ditch filled with bodies, silent witnesses to humanity's collapse. When published, the American public could no longer ignore the truth. My Lai became a symbol of everything wrong with the Vietnam War. Protests erupted, students marched, activists called for an end to the war. The anti-war movement gained momentum, fueled by images that no one could forget. Yet, in the midst of outrage, the Army continued to protect many of its own. Only one man would be prosecuted, Lieutenant William Calley. The question remained, who was truly responsible, and could one soldier represent the moral failure of an entire military apparatus? The world was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Obedience, fear, and systemic pressure can transform ordinary men into instruments of atrocity. And the survivors of My Lai, villagers, soldiers like Thompson and Rittenhauer, journalists like Hersh, carried the weight of conscience long after the bullets stopped. The trial of Calley, scapegoat or symbol. Lieutenant William Calley became the public face of My Lai. The trial began in November 1970, almost 2 years after the massacre. Calley was charged with the murder of 22 civilians, a fraction of the total death toll. Soldiers testified, survivors gave harrowing accounts, and the world watched. Calley's defense was simple. I was following orders. He claimed he acted under the commands of his superior officers and in the context of combat stress. But the prosecution argued following orders is not a shield for murder. Witnesses described the methodical killing in the ditch, children shot, mothers pleading, villagers forced over corpses. The evidence was undeniable, yet the trial became more than a legal proceeding. It became a national debate. Was Calley a scapegoat sacrificed to preserve the Army's reputation? Or was he a symbol of moral failure in the fog of war? Public opinion was divided. Some supported Calley, claiming he was a patriot obeying orders. Others condemned him, pointing to the photographs and survivor testimonies. The court-martial concluded with a guilty verdict, life imprisonment. But political intervention followed. President Nixon reduced Calley's sentence to house arrest after just 3.5 years. Many soldiers who participated in the massacre or who failed to prevent it never faced trial. Captain Medina and other higher-ranking officers walked free. Calley's conviction was symbolic, justice for some but incomplete, for the families of the victims. For the survivors of My Lai, it was too little, too late. The trial forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths: obedience, fear, systemic failure, and moral responsibility. It showed that war is not only fought on the battlefield, but also within the conscience of every soldier. Echoes of My Lai, legacy, trauma. Today, My Lai is remembered not just for the massacre, but for its enduring lessons. A memorial stands where the village once was. Names of the dead carved in stone. Survivors walk by, some silently weeping, some speaking to the memory of lost family members. Hugh Thompson, who saved countless lives, received the Soldier's Medal decades later. He carried the moral weight of My Lai until his death. Soldiers who survived the massacre carried psychological scars. PTSD, nightmares, and moral injury haunted them for decades. Some never spoke of what they had witnessed or done. For America, My Lai became a turning point. The anti-war movement gained intensity. Public trust in government and the military was shaken. The images of murdered civilians forced a nation to ask, what price are we willing to pay in war? When do orders end and conscience begin? The story of My Lai reminds us that atrocities are not simply the result of evil individuals. They can emerge from obedience, fear, exhaustion, and the failure of systems to enforce morality. History, if nothing else, teaches vigilance. It warns future generations to question, to resist blind obedience, and to protect the vulnerable always. My Lai was a wound, but it is also a warning. Humanity can survive the worst of war, but only if conscience remains alive. This has been War Tales. Remember, reflect, and never forget.